Poem of the Week, number 31, Rocket Show by James K. Baxter, 1926 to 1972. First published on the 20th of July, 2022. Rocket Show. As warm north rain breaks over suburb houses, streaming on window glass, its drifting hazes covering harbour ranges with a dense hood, I recall how 18 months ago I stood, ankle deep in sand on an Otago beach, watching the fireworks flare over strident surf, in brain-grey ash, in heart the sea change flowing, of one love dying and another growing. For love grows like the crocus bulb in winter, hiding from snow and from itself the tender green frond in embryo, but dies as rockets die, white sparks of pain against a steel dark sky, with firebird wings trailing an arc of grief across a night inhuman as the grave, falling at length a dull and smouldering shell to frozen dunes and the wash of the quenching swell. There was little room left where the crowd had trampled grass and lupin bare, under the pines that trembled in gusts from the sea. On a sand hillock I chose a place to watch from. Then the rockets rose, oh marvellous, like self-destroying flowers on slender stems, with seed pods full of flares, raining down amber, scarlet pennies from heaven, on the skyward, straining heads and still sea haven. Had they brought death, we would have stood the same, I think, in ecstasy at the world-end flame. It is the rain streaming reminds me of those ardent showers, cathartic love and grief, as I walked home through the cold street by moonlight, my steps ringing in the October night. I thought of our strange lives, the grinding cycle of death and renewal come to full circle, and of man's heart, that blind Rosetta Stone, mad as the polar moon, decipherable by none. While certainly distinct from each other, I really believe that Australian and New Zealand poetry ought to be read and appreciated as belonging to a common tradition. Notwithstanding the obvious historical and cultural similarities between the two, the main reason, I hold, is that a more profound reciprocal readership would enrich and widen our understanding of what Australian and New Zealand poetry is and can be. Shortly put, we have much to learn and gain of each other. I think I might have mentioned elsewhere on this blog how unknown many of the best Australian poets are among an international audience, but speaking as an Australian, I can't say that we have given our Antipodean brethren any more of a fair go. During secondary school in Australia, we must have studied a score of Australian poets, but not a mention was made of a single one from New Zealand. I am somewhat ashamed to admit that this ignorance lived on until very recently, when I discovered the poetry of James K. Baxter, who, I am further ashamed to admit, is the only New Zealand poet represented on the website's Anthology of English Language Poetry. His poetry has been justly overlooked by me, since it is just as good as any written by an Australian. A few years ago, a deep blow was dealt to Baxter's posthumous legacy when it was revealed, through the public surfacing of a letter he had written to a friend, that he had committed marital rape. While the execrableness of the act is beyond words, it should not take anything away from his poetry, which ought to, and will, live unconditionally on through its own merit. Nonetheless, I can well imagine that it has already led to, or will lead to, the partial banishing of Baxter's poetry from libraries, bookshops and school curricula. Judging Google searches for his poetry, it seems like his poetry is regularly studied at school in New Zealand. Denying the immense heritage bequeathed by this very fine artist is tragic, and will be to the great detriment of New Zealand culture and literature in the future. Form. 3 stanzas of semi-bound verse. While there are some genuine rhyming couplets and lines of iambic pentameter, much of the rhyming is constituted of half-rhymes, and much of the poem is metrically irregular too. Analysis. The first 3 lines describe a rainfall over a landscape. This recalls a memory in the poet's mind, when just 18 months ago he was standing on a beach in the Otago region of New Zealand, watching a fireworks display. At that moment in his life the poet found himself in a melancholy state, in grey-grain ash. The cause behind this must have been a loss of love, but the end of the first stanza indicates that a new love is starting to take root, one love dying and another growing. The second stanza is a description of how love begins and ends, and the connection between this and the memory of the fireworks display is made clearer here. Love is born hidden and unnoticed, like the crocus bulb in winter, and dies like the rocket in an explosion of anguish before extinguishing into vacuity. Quote, "As rockets die, white sparks of pain against a steel dark sky, with firebird wings trailing an arc of grief across a night inhuman as the grave." End quote. In the following stanza, Baxter returns to the memory. He recalls the crowded beach and everybody's attention at watching the fireworks. The fireworks are made ambivalent here. On the one hand, they are something beautiful, marvellous, but also violent. They are self-destroying. Their connection to something much more perilous is made at the end of the stanza, where Baxter writes that the crowd would have been just as rapt looking upon the fatal flares of a battlefield. And I quote, "Had they brought death, we would have stood the same, I think, in ecstasy at the world-end flame." End quote. In the final stanza, the poet returns briefly to the present before returning to his memory. As he looks on the falling rain, he was reminded of the falling flares of the fireworks. He then recalls walking home after the display. While doubtlessly still melancholy, there is something soothing in his understanding of the cyclical, ever-shifting nature of love. Quote, "As I walked home through the cold street by moonlight, my steps ringing in the October night, I thought of our strange lives, the grinding cycle of death and renewal come full circle." End quote. The poet does not, however, want to indicate that he has found an answer or solution to his problems. The only discovery he has made is of love's enigmatic mystery. Quote, "Man's heart, that blind Rosetta Stone, mad as the polar moon, decipherable by none."